let's look back on some 20th century handhelds. Tokyo toy company Epoch had some interesting contributions to video games. From their home console, there was also a wireless controller in 1975, to their 1984 Game Pocket computer's ability to store games locally, on top of separate cartridges. In 1981, Epoch would introduce Monster Panic, where you were rewarded for every ascension of 3 floors of iconic monsters, from Donkey Konging a mummy to sword fighting a skeleton. The following year, they'd release Dracula House, which was more complex, having you break into the vampire's house to find where they sleep and rob their caskets while trying not to get caught, even having to worry to unlock doors. Epoch wouldn't be alone in releasing these games either. Bandai are always the first I think of when thinking of early 80s handhelds. They even advertised solar power for your handheld, and released a variety of games from 1982's Mystery of the Sunken Ship, where you enjoy fun with sharks, to Invaders of the Mummy's Tomb, where the rising dead might spook you, but not away from a little tomb raiding. 1982 would also bring the world Terror House, which is the Bandai handheld I see brought up the most to this day. You have terrors to jibe before even making it into the house of iconic monsters. And when Epoch released their new handheld with separate swappable cartridges, so did Bandai. The 1984 Digicassette, short for digital cassette, would have its cartridges take up the entire top half of the device, though the cake is still taken for me by the Microvision's massive cartridges in the 70s. With the Digicassette, the screen is actually built into the cartridges themselves, and would have Mount Fuji explosion. Can you imagine that happening? But believe it or not, the lava may not be your biggest worry, as there are monsters about to keep down. Now these handhelds that supported separate swappable games never seemed to set the world on fire. I'm surprised games built into wristwatches were more the direction things went in from a convenience standpoint, but I can see their button form factor not being the feat of engineering and envisioned of Breakout being played with the rotating clickable bezel, Vortex style. I guess the one game built in handhelds were a lower price, more digestible purchase. You don't even need batteries with Bandai's solar-powered games like Escape from the Devil's Doom, where you attempt to ascend to the heavens. And speaking of which, Nintendo's been in the commercial video game business since before Pong, and since April of 1980 had been slowly earning the handheld market with their one-game built-in Game & Watches. I was surprised to see some of these in horror game lists, but that's probably because I'm in the minority who aren't absolutely terrified of sharks. You had games like Lifeboat where you steer said lifeboat through shark-infested waters to rescue survivors of a burning ship, or Parachute, where the waters those parachuters are landing in are also riddled with sharks. There is a charm and use for the quick fun game, but as home games took advantage of being able to keep people in front of the screen for longer experiences than arcades, portable games followed in that direction. April of 1989 would see Nintendo be the one to finally launch a handheld supporting swappable games into the stratosphere with the Game Boy. Its games often mirror the game design of Nintendo's family computer, which was the most popular home PC of its time. As a matter of fact, it shared quite a portion of its library, like Swamp Thing, Kid Dracula, Gremlins 2, Alien 3, Bram Stoker's Dracula, and it even got ports the family computer didn't, like Bubble Ghost, Godzilla-kun, and The Infamous Case, where Kemco cloned the puzzle platformer PP Hammer and the Mnemonic Weapon as Mickey Mouse 4 The Labyrinth of Magic, and brought it to Europe as Garfield's Labyrinth, before bringing it to the US as The Real Ghostbusters. As you might suspect, this results in regions' IPs feeling like unfitting skins over Mnemonic Weapon, like using your proton pack to just dig up things. So thankfully, the Game Boy already had HAL Laboratories' Ghostbusters 2, a more dedicated experience that's an example of a Game Boy game having a home console sequel. The Ghosts and Goblins spin-off Gargoyle's Quest is another example of this, and an interesting concept for gameplay. I usually see it compared to Dragon Quest, but I might compare it more to Zelda 2, where you have quite the top-down world to explore with towns and people to talk to, with random battles and dungeons taking place in a real-time side-scrolling perspective that has the verticality you'd more expect of Ghosts and Goblins. And you are a winged gargoyle after all. You'd think handhelds would be the domain of the simple quick Game & Watch style game, but it ended up being a mix alongside these much larger games that needed save systems. The Game Boy, of course, is the birthplace of the highest-grossing media franchise in humanity's history, Pokemon, which itself loves to use horror, like its initial game's death-themed dungeon being in a town that's gained quite the sizable fan base as a horror location, inspiring much horror. And on a side note, I always found it funny that people express how scary they find the error messages in the Game Boy's camera to be. I can't tell if they're intentional given the sound either. It has that "this isn't PS2 software" or "fun is infinite" energy. If you're ever in charge of software, make the error messages as scary as possible. I'm more weirded out by the crying child in the shoot mode, but I love hearing people describe what scares them in games. It can be the silliest thing sometimes. While Nintendo would remain dominant in the market with this affordable device, the more power-hungry, of course, always had the option to pay more than twice as much for a less compact device with more horsepower. Releasing the same year as the Game Boy, the Atari Lynx offered full-color 16-bit games. But for horror fans, 1991's Dracula the Undead would not exactly take advantage of that color capability. as it mimics the look of a sepia-toned film from the time of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel, which this game has him read to you. You take on the role of John Harker trying to survive this classic horror, but to avoid hitting you with too much exposition and lack of gameplay, you can see Bram skips pages and summarizes parts that I really liked in the book. I guess he wants to skip to the good parts, but I miss the mood setting of some of the parts he rushes through. Now, competitors of course had always been around every corner in the handheld market. Among them, Nintendo's chief competitor in the home market, Sega, would aim to compete with the Game Boy with the strength they held over Nintendo in that home market, being that they had a 4th generation home console out for years, and Nintendo still hadn't. Though, they perhaps didn't want to sacrifice too much sleekness and affordability for horsepower like many viewed the Atari Lynx doing. It fit in a middle ground between the two, and apart from games that released on both their home and portable console, Sega's Game Gear had some interesting exclusives like a sequel to 1987's Alien Syndrome. The original saw Ricky and Mary rescuing comrades through a horrifying infestation. The sequel, set and released 5 years later, sees a space transport sent out of Mayday as they're faced with an unknown creature, plunging Ricky and Mary back into action against its universe's unsung monster designs. It can be really fun exploring and not knowing what you're going to run into. There was even a third game for the PSP in 2007, taking place 100 years later and seeing Lieutenant Eileen Harding enter a ship fallen to the Syndrome, on a rescue mission where you get to see some of these monsters rendered in polygons. But the Game Gear ultimately seemed to lean closer to the Lynx than it did the Game Boy, and its success seemed to mirror that. Perhaps similarly, you rarely hear about how the PC engine known as starting the 4th generation had a handheld at this time that took its home console's physical games. A true companion you don't need to rebuild your library for, including Samurai Ghost, Devil's Crush, but CD games like Horror Story, Godzilla Legends, and the Them parody It Came From the Desert won't play on it. Unless you have a workaround to hook up the home system CD attachment, which I guess is doable if not cumbersome. Doubling as a portable television, you can use the GT as a portable monitor to play home systems themselves. And I guess with a car adapter, just about any home system can be made portable, with this putting them in that stereotypical Game Boy form factor. But at this point, we're really stretching the definitions. Without all that, the GT is still farther than I've ever seen a handheld take things. I know the Sega Nomad took home games, but the last gen home games by the time it came out. Compared to the Game Boy, which would soon slim down even more, these things were like carrying a 1970s cell phone. And keep in mind, this is a time when most people are buying batteries every time the power-hungry things ran out of juice. That's a big reason Nintendo remained at the top of the handheld market in the 1990s. They exercised so much caution to sacrificing portability, affordability, and power management to the hardware being more powerful. They made it just powerful enough for the fun factor of 3rd generation game design to do the rest. That's also why handhelds like the Supervision and big corporations can feel too simple. Their library's game design can feel a generation behind the bar that the NES raised video games to. The Game Boy is a feat perhaps even more impressive than the portable VR headset that followed in 1995. You'd think VR and horror games would be a match made in heaven. But, despite VR being around since at least the 60s, there's not a lot of 20th century examples. Over those decades of refinement, VR had however become so approachable that Nintendo saw opportunity to make a cheap portable headset. Since the 80s, Reflection Technology Inc. was developing the Private Eye, monochrome red VR whose perfect blacks created a greater illusion of depth for its red graphics to contrast with. Apparently everyone from Hasbro to Sega passed on it with the concerns of the motion sickness and being unimpressed by it being monochrome. But you know what else was monochrome? The Game Boy. And it was dominating the market. The problem, however, is portable VR means you can walk around without seeing your surroundings, which was a liability concern Nintendo was ultimately too afraid of. The compromise was to not ship with the head strap and instead a desk stand for you to lean into like you're watching a movie in the 1800s. To this day, you need to buy third-party head straps for Nintendo VR to cut down on the amount of people walking down the stairs while playing Breath of the Wild. But unlike how modern Nintendo VR supports head tracking, knowing the Virtual Boy would be leaned into like coin-operated binoculars made them ditch the head tracking in the 90s. And I know some VR heads might consider head tracking to be the reason to use VR, but within the niche of VR, Virtual Boy is one of the most well-known headsets in history, and if a game can only have one color, red would be the stereotypical one for horror games. Innsmouth is a 1995 first-person portable VR survival horror game set in 1922 Massachusetts. Remember, the game looked more 3D when viewing it through the headset, but you play as a detective, offered an incredible payday if you find a book in the infamous forest locals are too scared to go near. Once you find this book, however, you realize what this is all about. It's the Necronomicon. And the curiosity was irresistible. You had to crack open the book to just get a peek. And with that, you have quite the horror adventure to hopefully get to one of the game's multiple endings. What Lovecraft-inspired horrors will you encounter as you explore this mansion with the limited inventory looking for an escape? Now, the Virtual Boy was not as relatively cheap as buying an attachment for your phone in 2014. You can buy 3 Game Boys for the price of it. But having gained a reputation as the popular cheap alternative to even Nintendo was Tiger Electronics. They're probably best known for their one-game built-in handhelds, but did have ones with swappable games like the Quiz Whiz testing your knowledge with Monster Mania, or the R-Zone, which really exudes Tiger's reputation. You could pay $180 for Nintendo's portable VR headset, or $30 for Tiger Electronics' one-eyed AR games and enjoy perhaps sub-second console generation games like Area 51 reflected off a transparent lens. They did try to release a premium handheld console for $70 that had everything from a touchscreen and stylus to native internet, but it sold so poorly they quickly refined it to also being $30 by the end of the 90s. The 1990s are when smartphones started popping up as everything was becoming a PDA to replace daybooks. You could also imagine phone games were popping up as anything with a screen tends to see video games. And this would eat into some people's need to buy a separate handheld to play games, but even the simplest of games could still sell hardware. While people were playing their Gigapet Salem the Cat, Bandai, who had found much success with Tamagotchi, was trying to figure out how to get male players involved in this virtual pet craze. Pokemon pulled it off the previous year, so Bandai would become their competitor with the Digital Monster, raising and caring for collectible pets to battle each other. Both Pocket and Digital Monsters became the handheld equivalent of the ancient pastime of kids collecting bugs to battle each other. And this tiny keychain form factor would continue from big companies. 1998 would see Sega release the visual memory in July with the Digital Monster-like Green Godzilla edition, its name being for its planned purpose of being a companion to their upcoming 6th generation console, serving as portable storage. A second screen experience was slotted into controllers, and being a dedicated handheld, some Dreamcast games would even have companion games for you to earn rewards on the go to transfer into the home game. PlayStation's mascot Toro actually comes from their similar handheld, the Pocket Station, released 6 months later, to also serve as a dedicated handheld that can double as a memory card for their home systems. Despite their interesting libraries, both will be discontinued in about 3 years after their release, and I find they're less looked back on than other handhelds, usually only raising the curiosity of people seeing them referenced in more remembered home games, including people going back to play through long-run series and finding out they had a game for the Pocket Station. To me, these systems are an example of the conundrum of making a handheld small to be portable, but keeping it big enough to be ergonomic. Still, I've grown a fondness for the aesthetic and view them with intrigue alongside what Nintendo did at the time. Between Sega and PlayStation's handheld, after nearly 10 years, the Game Boy got a sequel in the Game Boy Color, featuring double the clock speed, 4 times the RAM, and backwards compatibility with most Game Boy games as well. But it has an insane library of its own to sink your teeth into. Whether your favorite vampire hunter is Blade or Buffy, there's a game for you. Whether you want a more serious fixed camera survival horror, a universal monster game, an Aliens, or Smurfs nightmare, there's a game for you. Maybe you just want another Ghostbusters, Addams Family, or Gremlins game for the new hardware. But I can see those being good games. Where I'll jump in today is the state of the Godzilla games. Somehow it slipped my mind that the TriStar Godzilla had an animated series that continued the story, and that series had game adaptations. Now, a fun fact is some Game Boy Color games are backwards compatible with the original Game Boy, and this is one of them. A slow-moving autorunner that squanders the fact that this is one of the most agile incarnations of Godzilla. The story is told via chatroom-looking message exchanges, but I feel there had to be more exhilarating scenes from the show to recreate, and in faster-paced gameplay. The variety of locations feel fresh, but the slow pacing kills it. I don't know if a priced Game Boy Color game is the place for a less than hour-and-a-half long autorunner, but even within that genre, I think the 1988 Godzilla autorunner everyone makes fun of is more fun because it's faster. The 99 Game Boy Color game Godzilla The Series was followed up by Godzilla The Series Monster Wars, which lets you stop moving first and foremost. You can't scroll left, but it aids how defense has been changed from auto-regenerating health and block meters to health pickups you hit with your breath and now as a cursor to aid aim. And honestly, this makes it a lot more interesting. Whereas you just auto-walk through the previous games with little worry, I could see a kid coming back to this game to try to beat the challenge of it, which can even complement the slower pacing a bit more because you're choosing to inch forward with caution. They also removed the footstep sound that constantly played in the first game to make the audio design pleasant for longer periods. And I'm a bit more interested in the monsters of this game, so while I'm not in agreement with this being the gameplay for a Godzilla game, it is fascinating and commendable to see how they change the gameplay of a game I only see negative opinions of, attempting to make it a much better experience regardless of how people feel it turned out. Interestingly, unlike the first game, the sequel is not backwards compatible with the original Game Boy though. And perhaps you'd regret the investment if you knew the Game Boy Color would last as long as the VMU and Pocket Station before getting into the sequel in 2001. It is also backwards compatible with most Game Boy and Game Boy Color games. Though even some of the ones that are playable are buggy, you know how backwards compatibility is. So I guess there is still a benefit to playing on original hardware and appreciate the craftsmanship and history of it. The Game Boy Color is the first big handheld Nintendo release without Mr. Game & Watch himself, Gunpei Yokoi, who passed the previous year after starting his own company, with his final work being to collaborate with Bandai to initially lead the development of what I consider to be the swan song of Bandai handhelds, appropriately named The Wonder Swan. Whether you're playing a port like Clock Tower, a fresh adaptation like Uzumaki, or an original sequel like Ghosts and Goblins got, The Wonder Swan has a library that might pique your interest. You have visual novels like the Terror series where you might find yourself trapped under a pile of babies. Or my favorite, Ring Infinity. Yes, the series about a cursed tape that acts as a chain letter where if you don't get someone else to watch it, its subject Sadako will have you referred to in the past tense. Infinity is about the culture of trading VHS tapes at school, which is such a great setting for The Ring. Think of the skepticism and daringness of teenagers, on top of the fact that you were often trading VHS tapes that weren't labeled. The setting combined with the writing is such a great mix of hanging out with friends in a nostalgic time with the horror wrench thrown into the mix, as rumors of the cursed videotape start to feel more and more real. Especially after someone at your school is taken by cardiac arrest, leading to a suspicion that she saw the tape, and worry you did too. Sometimes memories are preserved in dreams and you have one matching the rumors of the tape's description. But is your brain just creating that because it's on your mind? Or are you actually remembering seeing it mixed in with the random tapes you fall asleep to? There's an interesting conversation you can have with a schoolmate where you speculate the rules of what counts as seeing the tape. Like what if it was only in your peripheral vision while you were focusing on something else? The game can hit you with these new ways to think about the ring, like if the curse is the negative energy of Sadako. Would filming someone who's cursed have the same effect as copying the VHS tape? Or the most fascinating to think about to me, a scene where you deep dive online to learn about the tape and see people on the internet are talking about it. Usually these kind of ghost stories present in isolation as if this is only happening to the protagonist and anyone else who knows keeps it a secret. But this game paints the interesting picture that after striking so much, all of society is becoming aware of Sadako's existence. It gave the later game a feeling of countrywide panic to me, and the most genius thing was not knowing if you saw it or not. Are you attending a girl's wake to sneak up to her room, hiding from the footsteps of her family members as you look for a copy of the tape to pass on for nothing? What if you're not cursed and you're gonna curse yourself? Also, since the game isn't rated, I have no idea how dark the story can get, which is a fear in itself. Even outside of the game, I find it very interesting to see people speculate online about the motives of characters in the story. It's a fun story to think about. A little over a year after The Wonder Swan released, The Wonder Swan Color dropped for a noticeably heftier price, and is probably most notably the home to the remake that would become the incarnation of Final Fantasy I used in every subsequent release to this day. It's also home to some Inuyasha games, which is a series that feels surreal to see again. It's 2002, and I'm in someone else's house trying to get some shut-eye with the only illumination being the TV I'm watching from a sofa bed where an episode of some new series comes on, where bodies are rising with the body language of holding a puppet in the air by its strings. Turns out they're being marionetted by hair, and they'd come right at you with knives. Of course I fall asleep and dream about the situation, but have no idea what I saw. There's a mystique to television with no guide, no rewind feature, no history or recommended finding the right thing for you. Just pure, random art that you may never see again. You could spend the rest of your life wondering. But in this case I had a hunch about that art style and got the name off the girl at school who had all the anime VHSs, but instead of risking her trading me a cursed tape, I filed its name in my head and put it off until I stopped watching shows as a whole, with it keeping the mystique of being some horror thing I saw in the middle of the night and remembered for almost 25 years. Now it's time to finally figure out what it was. You see, the show was by Bandai's film company Sunrise, and across its initial run was a trilogy of Wonder Swan games that take you through its story. The premise is that a modern middle schooler stumbles upon an ancient monster-filled world through a well by her house, where she finds the demon Inuyasha who her ancestor once best had sealed away. She has the power to subjugate this demon to combat the horrors of this new world like the monster I've remembered all these years. Excellent design. I would describe the combat as Pokemon Light, where you're yelling for the demon to attack, block, dodge, or leave him to his own judgment on what to do in his turn, with the whole temperament system as the simple combat is not really the point of the game. This is first and foremost a teen girl romance novel, which I was not expecting, but began to suspect with the pink frilly packaging and advertising. Now you're not trapped in the past. You can go back and forth to the present at any time to look at the photos in your diary and ask your mom for snacks, while in the past you have a dog boy to build a relationship with and adventure alongside your fantasy friend group into a world of classic mythological horror monsters. I easily see the appeal of what's essentially an episodic visual novel with minigames you can access whenever you want on the go and maybe even a little resource farming. It's easy to digest and carried on the back of its setting's aesthetic. But I think its audio, visual direction, and abridged nature is where it sells its source material short. Now you can recreate all the camera angles from the show with Mode 7's graphics, but that's a lot of sprites, and a visual novel like a Ring Infinity wouldn't need to. Sometimes I worry about too many people seeing video game graphics as they are instead of them being building blocks for the imagination, and a lot of that can be on the game designer. Player agency isn't just a part of gameplay, but visual design and writing. This is done well at the beginning of the game, but for the most part I noticed the game neither shows nor tells. There's a general lack of scene setting and flavor text to guide one's imagination into seeing anything other than people in idle poses reciting dialogue. Even if you've seen the show, I can't imagine this being a satisfying recreation of these moments to relive. Still an overall fine game, but with a valuable lesson to learn from. If I were to pick a Digimon to this game's Tamagotchi, I'd raise you the Neo Geo Pocket's Color Revision being home to Dark Arms Beastbuster 1999. A dungeon crawl that's also about being a foreigner to a monster-filled world, but this time, you're entering a contract with the master of the Dark Realm, who teaches you to steal souls to develop bioweapons with him, and lets you stay at his house. From here you can adventure out into a whole horror world that I found so interesting to explore. The circus was so inspiring as a horror location, and I felt the dread of approaching its entrance and just wondering what it's gonna look like inside the tent. The game's story likewise gives you a lot of gameplay in between to think about it as it slowly unfolds, feeling like a reward for that gameplay. It's complemented by the contextualization of you living in a house where your bed, toolshed, and roommate to build things with and talk to are, with you adventuring into the world from there, achieving the feeling that you're exploring a changing world through the way it directs how you interact with its levels and characters. Bravo on this horror game.
Analysts estimate that global revenue for wireless gaming will reach $4.4 billion by 2006.
As the 21st century rolled around, you might say a duopoly formed for phones went to survive the iPhone's rapid success. Competitors from Samsung to Sony all joined under the Open Handset Alliance, all joining under one operating system to compete with Apple's breakthrough in packaging a Pocket PC, though it was a PC that didn't allow you to install programs. Until backing down from the backlash of that birthed the video game-filled App Store to be pre-installed on future devices, with the OHA having the Google Play Store. And with having one of these duopoly's devices becoming an expectation of all first-world humans, their pre-installed stores became the most accessible video game marketplaces in history. The #1 place people play video games became handhelds. And Nintendo's approach to game design dominated this market multiple times too. As they say, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Their success upon entering the tablet market is an example of their philosophy of making fun with mature technology. Just about every tablet or smartphone is a hybrid. The Sega Nomad and PSP were hybrids. But much like the Game Boy finally broke through swappable games, the Nintendo Switch finally popularized the decades-old capability of handhelds, attracting the massive untapped audience previous handhelds tried and failed to attract use of, which has opened so many doors for handheld players and developers alike. Handhelds being bigger than they ever were in the 20th century gives us new, bigger handheld horror games than ever before. But let's not forget the lessons learned from our past. I'm Epoch.